And now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's fashion, Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And now, here's Ted.
February 24th marks the second anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a war which, according to UN sources, has claimed the lives of some 10,000 civilians and has caused more than 6 million to seek refuge outside their homeland. Former Toronto Mayor John Tory recently returned from the war-torn nation and shared with me his experiences and thoughts on the ongoing conflict. What was the goal and also the motivation to go to Ukraine in the middle of a war?
Well, it really started with a director friend of ours, Afghani, his name is, and he is a well-known documentary film producer and has produced one film already on the war in Ukraine, really just kind of trying to document the impact it was having on the country. He is looking at doing another film, in fact, is working on doing another film that has more to do with children and the impact of the war on children. And so my brother, Michael, who lives in London, and I, who had both met Afghani when he premiered his film here in Toronto and also in London. I was at the London screening. He said, well, look, if I'm going to do this filming, why don't you come with me? And so we did, and we did it because we both thought, my brother Michael and I, that it would be not only an opportunity to help him with his film, which we're doing financially, but an opportunity for us to see for ourselves what's going on here. Now, we didn't go to the front, as it were, but we were in Kiev and went around to all the towns surrounding Kiev that were the subject of terrible atrocities at the beginning. And then the Ukrainians miraculously pushed back. And I understand the pushback better now that I've been there and met the people and seen their resilience. So that's why we went. And subsequent to that, I've seen Afghani, and he's still working on the film. It likely won't be finished until sometime this year, later this year.
Yeah, most oftentimes, of course, when people enter into an unfamiliar situation, they do so with preconceived notions of what to expect. When you headed to Ukraine, what were you expecting and what did you subsequently see? And how much different was it?
Well, it's funny because people who live in North America and who are of a certain age, I mean, unless you're really old, and there aren't many left who've sort of been through the experience of the Second World War and seeing the aftermath of war and seeing some of the, toll that's taken. I mean, we live here in North America where many people lost their lives in great wars of one kind or another, but we didn't see the devastation here, And so I was expecting to see some of that, but I was horrified at the scale of it, especially in the towns surrounding Kiev. We went to these towns that were just wiped out. I mean, it looked like, bombs had gone off, which indeed they had. The only comparable thing I had seen was when I went to Haiti in the aftermath of the earthquake, with your colleague and mine, John Moore, and we saw there but that was caused by an earthquake. We saw, the graves of people who were young men who had been killed in the war, and there are just places like cemeteries that are full of these freshly, buried people with their pictures. We met their families. So I was expecting some of that, but I think expecting it and actually experiencing it are two different things. I was expecting Kiev, for example, to be a place where, basically they had ground to a halt. But what you found, thanks to the resilience of the Ukrainian people, is when you're in that city, and I'll put an asterisk beside this because we should talk about the air raids, which is something else that people in North America have never been really through. Yeah. But people were, during the day, they were strong. And you notice, of course, there were many fewer men on the street than women, but traffic was going on, business was being carried on to, one extent or another. And it was only at night that the Russians chose to have the air raids because I guess they thought that would scare people as much as anything else. So one of the other things you notice, and it sounds like a small thing, but just to get there, because there's no air travel, and you don't think about in wars, of course, there can't be air travel to the entire country of Ukraine, basically just because it's not safe. And so you end up having to take a 20-hour train ride, which most people, again, wouldn't have done to go anywhere. You wouldn't do that nowadays. I mean, you might if you were taking the Great Canadian all the way to BC on a vacation, but you're not going to do that. And so there's all kinds of things like that just left you with this overwhelming impression of heartbreaking the graves and the loss of life and so on and the devastation, but also heartwarming, which was the resilience of the people you met who were just so strong and so determined to stay the course. And so it was I don't know whether it met or exceeded or fell short of any expectations, but it was just an extraordinary experience.
You talk about the fact that most of us who are alive today have never experienced this because we weren't around for the Second World War, and so we don't carry with us those memories. And when you talk to people who have experienced the war, many of whom at least, are hesitant to talk about it because it's so painful. I'm talking about people who were in the Second World War who have come back since, and they don't want to talk about something that occurred years and years and years ago. The people who are experiencing it now, how reluctant or how open were they to discuss what was going on now?
Well, that varied, Ted, but it varied more based on the degree to which they were grieving. And so we went one time to a very small cemetery in a kind of, I'll have to call it a kind of rural area, maybe an hour and a half out of Kiev. And there they had fashioned a small cemetery for people from this town who'd been killed, young men from this town who'd been
Yeah.
killed. And the moms mostly were there because I think the dads were off, fighting or doing something. But these were young men, 19, 20, 21, and their pictures were there. And they looked like, kids who could almost be my grandchildren, let alone my children. And some of them were grieving to such an extent that you couldn't speak to them at all because they just weren't, and all they could do is kind of hold their hand and try to comfort them. Others would speak very openly about it, and they would just speak. And it's funny because I expected, there'd be a lot of hostility in the way they spoke, and there wasn't. There was a certain anger. There was a certain, obviously lack of understanding of how this could go on, how these atrocities could be committed. But at the same time, they were they were just, again, very courageous and very determined to go forward. And that determination that I met with person after person after person was so amazing to me. When they had lost their own children, when they had experienced the devastation. We went to the town, and some of these names I'm gonna forget now, but there's a town just outside Kiev, where they did massacre the people, and there's a big wall that has hundreds of names on it, hundreds of names.
Yeah.
And we went and saw where the mass graves were, and yet those people who are left, were willing to talk and willing to talk in a very courageous manner about their experience, and that was remarkable to me. So I guess I would say, and I know the people you're talking about whose kids would tell you that their father, in particular, their father or grandfather, never talked about the war, wouldn't talk about it, even though they maybe spent sometimes years overseas and come back. These people were more willing to talk than I thought, and same with the armed forces people. We met quite a few of the armed forces people, and they're engaged, but they were willing to talk and tell us the story of what had happened there, which was just, again, an extraordinary story and an extraordinary example of courage and pushing back in a way I think that the Russians didn't expect, nor necessarily did the rest of us, that were watching from far away.
It's been almost 2 years since Russia invaded. It'll be 2 years in next month in February. Uh, there comes a point in everyone's life when your resolve is beaten down because you're just so tired. You can only take so much. Do you think that the people of Ukraine are getting to that point, or do you think that their resolve cannot be beaten?
I think the resolve cannot be beaten. The only thing that can beat them, Ted, is us, meaning us in the West. If we back away from the kind of support we have to continue to offer, and we've been pretty solid. I mean, Canada, the United States, and a whole bunch of other countries in Europe have been solid. And if we lose our resolve, then, I don't know how that can't have an impact on everybody in Ukraine, from the leaders right down to the average people on the street, because we have to stand behind them. And, this is an important moment in history. I mean, it isn't just some kind of a regional conflict going on involving two countries, et cetera. It is about, the whole notion of whether it is acceptable without pushback for one country to walk into another country, a democracy, and then the other one is not a democracy, and there's a tyrant that's in charge. Is it okay? Are we just going to say it's okay? And where does that stop if you let that happen? So I'm fervently of the view that Canada has to stand up, stronger than ever, and I think we seem to be not wavering in all of that. What's going on in the U.S. to me is shameful, because what they're doing is kind of using support for Ukraine as a bargaining chip, as opposed to saying, no, it's not going to be a bargaining chip, because it's the right thing to do to stand up for democracy and to support people who are, our fellow democratic countries that are in trouble and being invaded again by autocrats and whatnot. But I guess we'll have to see. But I think that's the only thing that can defeat the resolve of the Ukrainian people, is all of us slowly sort of drifting away, because it won't happen by somebody standing up and making an announcement. like it happened in Vietnam many years ago, where they just said, we're out of here. It'll happen just by slowly, people losing their resolve, losing the determination to be as supportive as we need to be. And I just pray that doesn't happen.
When people say to you, we should be spending our money on our own concerns here, and you look at now in the city of Toronto, where people are about to face potentially double-digit increases in their in their housing payments due to a number of factors. Our economy is not the strongest. We've got serious debt federally. People say we need to take care of our own problems, not problems of people who exist thousands of miles away from us. How do you
Yeah, what
respond
if
to
they'd
that?
said that? What if they'd said that? We were talking earlier on about World War II. What if they'd said that in World War II? Well, we'll just stay out of that. It's something going on over there, and whatnot. And we know now some things we didn't even know to the full extent then, about millions of people being killed, and about then again similarly a tyrant who was just marching into countries and taking over. And like we would rue the day, and it would have a devastating impact on our quality of life, however you want to say it could happen, if democracies in Europe, and I say democracies plural, some of which are newly minted democracies after the Soviet experience, were just once again falling under a dictatorship. And so, I mean, to me, there are issues bigger than, and we're a wealthy enough country that if you look at the amount we've invested, I don't know what the total is in helping Ukraine so far, it is a relatively small amount relative to the total wealth and the total resources of this country. And I think sometimes there are issues that are bigger than that say, no, democracy is something we have to protect as one of the beacons of democracy in the whole world. I mean, our democracy functions here probably as well as any in the world, given some of the troubles they're having in the US and so on, but it functions very well. But we can't afford to say, well, we're okay, and therefore it's okay for us to let other democracies be invaded and attacked and have atrocities committed. So I don't pay much attention to that, and it's not such an amount of money that it would allow us overnight to solve the housing problem. I mean, that's going to be solved
Yeah.
more by will in a way than by money.
So, given that, what are your thoughts of Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives voting against extending Operation Unifier?
I thought it was politics at its worst, to be honest, because in the end, where they were sort of saying, well, it's because of the fact that we somehow required them as part of that agreement to have a carbon tax. Well, it was just proven to be categorically false. I mean, the media, and everybody who was asked about it said it was false. And so it was an attempt to kind of play politics with something that should be beyond politics. And that's why I say I'm so troubled by what I see in the US, where it becomes a bargaining chip. And in Canada, it became something different. It wasn't a bargaining chip. Our system works differently, but it was a kind of fabrication was used as a reason to hold that debate up and make it look like we weren't going to do our part. And so to me, I just look at these things and say, can't we place some things above politics and just say our standing up for democracy, our standing with our friends? We have such a wonderful Ukrainian community here who I know so well in different parts of the country, but especially in the GTA. Doesn't that sort of, supersede politics? And in that case, it didn't, at least for a couple of weeks. But I think all's well that ends well. But it's just one of those things where you shake your head and say, why? I mean, this is an issue that is bigger than petty politics in Canada or petty politics in the US.
Did you have a chance to talk to young children and get their perspective on what was going on? And how much did they understand what it is that is happening around them?
I don't think they do understand, what is happening. I mean, they're certainly aware of the fact. Like, for example, I went to visit a school, a public school, like we would call it a public school in the sense it was like an elementary school, grades 1 to 8 or 1 to 7, I
Right.
think. And the whole school had been literally had missiles and other kinds of armaments shot at the school, to the point where when you went inside, I wish I could show you the pictures, the whole place was devastated. It looked like somebody had gone through the school and just literally decided to lay waste to the whole place. And it was closed. I mean, obviously, it's not. I don't know if it'll ever reopen. And so we talked to some of the kids that went to that school, and of course, they know something terrible happened. But if you said, do they understand, why it's happening? I guess no more so than any other kids would, including kids here.
Yeah.
Do they understand why they get awakened in the night by air raids? I'd never experienced that. I mean, you have to experience that once in your life to have a different feeling about what people are going through. And of course, they do it deliberately. Well, the air raids that I, had happened I think I was there for 6 days. There was 3 at night and 1 during the day. And the one during the day, people were amazing, including kids, at how calmly they just proceeded into the subway, where I went with them. We stayed there for 2 hours and then we're allowed to come out. The ones at night are truly scary because you're sound asleep and the app on your phone goes off and you suddenly have to leave your hotel room. I slept in my clothes and just had to put on my shoes to go into the subway.
Yeah.
And then people are sleeping there, and I don't think kids, they just know something's different and something's not good. But I think that they're remarkably innocent. Now, I would say the exception would be, we only talked to a couple of kids who had actually lost one of their parents. And I think they had a keener understanding of something truly awful that had happened. And I think all the kids whose schools were bombed, or we saw whole apartment buildings where a whole chunk of the apartment building, like it's like it bitten like a quarter of the apartment building out of the side of it. Some monster had bitten it out, but it was done by a bomb. And I think those kids, again, knew something terrible had happened, but I don't think they have any idea why. How would they have that knowledge? I mean,
No.
yeah, it's tragic. And they're scarred too, Ted. That's the thing. I mean, the movie that Afghani, the director, is working on now, is going to demonstrate in two respects. I mean, one is remarkable examples of people who are physically scarred by this. In other words, they lost an arm or a leg in these atrocities that went on kids, I'm talking about. And the other part is harder to measure, but the psychological trauma that will be inflicted on these kids, either because they lost a relative or because they, lost their home and it was bombed out in an act of terrible violence, or, just the ongoing war itself. It will leave scars. We know that. I mean, we know it's like PTSD is a guarantee for a lot of those kids that will be with them for life, or certainly for a long time.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
I've had the great fortune to say that I've been associated with one of Toronto's finest names in men's clothing for more than 25 years. Tom's Place. Founded by Tom Mahalick's father in 1958, Tom's Place offers brand name men's apparel at unbeatable prices. But more than that, they boast a long-serving, knowledgeable, and friendly staff that can assist you whether you're looking for casual or formal attire. And they have plenty of first-class tailors on site. In addition, Tom and his family are well known for their philanthropic work. So if you're looking to deal with great people who can fulfill your clothing desires at outstanding prices, do yourself a favor and visit Tom's Place. They're open weekdays from 11 to 6, Saturdays 10 to 5, and Sundays noon to 5. You'll find Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Or check them out online at toms-place.com. Tom's Place will suit you. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor, or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866-309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Woloshyn.
Do you think that people had the opportunity that you have had, that they would have a better understanding, and that they would have more passion and empathy toward the cause of the Ukrainian people, and would not
I
be
think
so hesitant to
especially,
see their
yeah,
money
I think
hard
especially
away?
people from North America, Ted, especially people from North America. I mean, you think about it here. If you've lived your life as I have my whole life in North America, I've never experienced an air raid. Just that alone.
Yeah.
And that alone, never experienced an air raid. We've never experienced a war on these soils. We've had acts of terror like 9/11 and so forth. We've never had a war going on this soil here. And if you're in Europe, I think maybe your experience is a bit different because there have been different wars go on there. But I do think that seeing things for yourself. I mean, you just have to stand in front of a freshly filled in grave, and they have above them all a picture of the person that's in there, because and they have a little flag, a little Ukrainian flag, because it's honoring them as members of the armed forces who died. You just have to see that. You just have to go to that wall in the town that was put upon by the Russians, as I said, and see hundreds of names, and their birth dates were all listed there. And so some of them are as young as 4 years old, and some as old as 90. And you hear the story of the atrocities committed against the women in that same town when the Russians went through. So you just have to hear that from anybody and see those places I just described. And you're right. I think your perspective entirely changes. Maybe you were supported before, as I was, but then you're absolutely saying, look, I mean, we cannot lose our resolve on this, because this is just the ultimate in, in atrocious mistreatment. It's an understatement of one people to another and one country to another.
Do you think that Canada could and should give more?
Well, I'd have to look. I think we could. The answer is we could always give more, because I think they need more. And you see, even now in the recent times, they're saying that, it's difficult to continue to make progress on the sort of resistance. And there's just no question, but that they need more of everything, and that includes humanitarian things too. But yes, so I think the answer is yes, we could. I think our government has been steadfast. Our government has been, I think, generous. And I think that's all good, and I commend them, Mr. Trudeau and everybody, all the way through. Is there more we could do? Of course. Is there more? I mean, I think the main thing at this stage of the game is just to keep doing what we're doing. If we could preserve what we're doing and make sure the United States does help that to happen, and the European countries to stand solid, that in a way probably is more important at this stage. In other words, that we don't allow a situation to arise where there's less being done. And I think that would be step one. And then if you can make sure you maintain that, then maybe you could look at doing more. But I think, and by the way, they're aware of, even though Canada is obviously a smaller, contributor than the U.S., and that makes sense. They're certainly aware of Canada being a steadfast supporter, and I think that in some measure has to do with our generosity in accepting people here too. When I came back to Toronto, I had the honor and the privilege, and before I went, to meet some of the people that were coming here for refuge, and some of the families, and very courageous people, so I hope we just continue to stay the course. That's all.
You have just a couple of points of interest here. You have Ukrainian blood in you.
I do. Of course, the part of the called Galicia that my mother's family came from has been itself disputed territory over time, as between the Russians and the Ukrainians and so forth. But yeah, my great grandmother and my great great grandmother I knew until I was about 10. She lived to be 100 and something, 104, I think. And they came, as I say, right off the boat, as they say. Yeah. And yes, and so it's one of those things where it's a distant thing in some respect, but it's sort of, and I don't think it changed my view by much. In other words, I can't say I have relatives. I mean, there's probably some that I'm related to living back there that I don't know of, but it wasn't so much that shaped my own view, because the day the invasion took place, I went out when I was mayor and I raised the Ukrainian flag and said, it will fly here until the Russians are gone. And it's still there, unfortunately. It certainly has over time piqued my interest in things like the Holodomor and the war now, and the various things that have happened in between, usually involving the Russians, unfortunately.
Yeah. So for those people who, as time marches on and hopefully the situation gets better, for those people who hopefully will get a better understanding of what this will mean, describe to them how it could have turned out, the situation, had Ukraine just crumbled and given in to the Russians.
Well, I mean, the reason the Russians are interested in Ukraine, I mean, I'm not trying to excuse it or explain it as being in any way rational, but the reason they're interested is because it stands between them. And I think under Putin now, they once again have expansionist, tendencies, and they certainly, don't want to do us any good in the West, as it were, the Western democratic countries. And I think that if the Ukrainians had just given in, and the Russians, all these towns that I went to that were devastated and all the people killed, those were in the early days kind of taken by the Russians, and it looked like a matter of almost hours before Kiev itself was going to be taken, and then the country might have fallen. And if it had fallen, I mean, I think it was then only a matter of time before you looked at other countries like Latvia and Estonia. And we all know these countries that were, until quite recently in our lifetime, not democracies, they were dictatorships under the Soviet regime. The people lived a poor quality of life there. They certainly didn't know freedom. And, it sounds alarmist to say it, but I mean, again, going back to the Second World War, I think when the early going there, when Hitler walked into this place or that place, people said, oh, well, it's only the one place. And, they felt sorry about it, but they realized after a time, when he just kept marching and other atrocities were committed, that you had to stop this. And so I just think that I was amazed when I saw how close the Russians got, and how much devastation they caused in all these places all around Kiev, and the life that was lost in fighting back on them. I was at this Air Force base, and the Air Force base was heavily damaged, mostly by the fact that the Russians took control of it And it's the place where the world's largest airplane was, and the Russians destroyed that. But having said that, I mean, most of the devastation to the armed forces base, the Air Force base, was caused by the Ukrainians fighting back and chasing the Russians out.
Yeah.
And had they not done incredibly courageous things like that, I mean, I think we'd be in the situation today. Again, life goes on in Toronto and in Canada. You know, we're so fortunate that way. But there goes a country that fought hard for democracy, that is a democracy, and one down and how many to go. That's the way I look at it. And you just can't sort of turn your eyes away and say, "Oh well, it'll be fine. It's only one democracy." And so I just think,
and that's the point that I was hoping that you were going to make, that people, the ones who are hesitant to support Ukraine, are missing the picture. That it's not just about one country, as you pointed out.
That's exactly right. And it's a funny thing to say, and I don't mean this in any way to diminish, because we have 1 million fellow Canadians who are of Ukrainian background, and including yourself, and I guess including myself, the way I described it, some more immediate than others, some one generation away. And I think if it was France, because France was one of the sort of 2 founding countries and cultures that put this country together with the indigenous people, I don't know, maybe people would then be more worried, but they should, and I think they are worried about Ukraine. They understand. But I think it's no different than if they walked into France, or they walked into Holland, or they walked into England, as they were threatening to do decades ago, and said, we're going to come here and take over, whoever it was. I mean, some tyrant. And that's what's going on here. And so, I mean, it's about more than us, and it's about more than that country. It's about us, and it's about, because they are us. And, we're lucky in North America, because we're kind of geographically isolated too. But, if the United States got invaded, what we think about that, that'd be happening on our doorstep. And this is Ukraine.
Good point. John Tory, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. I appreciate it.
Well, Ted, one of the things that I hope you do, because you have a platform, so do I. I spoke about it the first time I was back on the air on the Toronto radio station, 1010, and I talked about how we must not lose our resolve. This is in December. And I hope people like you and me will continue to have people on to talk about these different kinds of experiences, because you know what it's like. When it goes out of the top of the news cycle, because it's replaced, in this case, by, among other things, another war that's awful, then people tend to forget. And that's when it's easier for those who want to say, well, let's not do this anymore. We're running out of money, or we're this, or we're that. And I just think we have to keep reminding people they are us. You need to hear stories from people like me, but there are others who could tell these stories, so that we don't lose our resolve, because that's so important. We must not lose our resolve on this, and we must support the Ukrainian people and the country of Ukraine.
Good point. Thanks very much.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you.
That's going to do it for another edition of the Ted Woloshyn Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to Paul Gatt. Thank you to Becky Coles. And don't forget, drop by our website, www.tedwoloshyn.ca, and check out our past episodes, and leave us your comments, your thoughts, questions, and positive, negative, we accept them all. And while you're online, don't forget to fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. In the meantime, you have a great week.
The Ted Woloshyn Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. The Ted Woloshyn Podcast is produced by me, Becky Coles. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more information on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca.